And then again, you know, contextual touchstones and what have you, but they're really not nice guys. So it's kind of understandable why, you know, in that context, it's much less black and white, despite the fact that, you know, fictional situations would be atrocious monsters in real life. Within the fictional context, it can be an appealing fantasy.
First episode of the new episode. It makes sense in context because it's the first episode of the new Let's Play series.
All these other things, because there is such clear context, and because it is such a massive issue. I mean, as far as I'm obviously the expectations of a given surrounding, of a given context, it's possible to learn all these things and thus know what is other context I need to fucking write this. So therefore, I can understand the context of like a phone call, because then you can just go
in my head than it is anything about them. But just some context, this is this kind of philosophical thought experiment, as it were. And so I didn't actually know that much about the wider context of Vietnam stuff. No, I can get that, you know, this is film. There have been loads.
Yeah, I can talk to you now because we're in a setting whereby I know the context of what is going on, whereby I have the... You've got fucking David Cameron taking Jeremy Corbyn out of context and calling him a terrorist sympathiser for pointing out a little bit of context. Like, you can clearly see, you know, it's 9 AM, but you can see the reflection.
He's a soldier from Iraq, from Afghanistan, sorry. So, for a bit of cultural context, and this episode aired really what delivers is the acting and the dialogue and the plot. So the context. And the jokes work. Okay.
And now you're going to take that out of context and make a little fairy story for yourselves.
And Queen and part of the United Civilization of the multiverse, they can have the context to say, hey, what's this? One of my fans is still from Wants to Play.
Got into, you know, what words mean what, and, you know, the various contexts and whatever. The actual story?
So you can kind of... This is kind of important for setting the context for Windows 10, where it's... No, I know those fuckers are gonna take me out of context, and they're gonna fucking joke at me and laugh at me, and they're gonna think that they're all fucking... Imagining some sort of Nazi taking that clip out of context of me going, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, and going, look at him, look.
It's a real thing, and it's out there, and you've got all of the context of it being in the 70s and all this. We have, I suppose that's kind of the wider socio-historical context of being a man, but I suppose on a quite important level, and because, you know, like I say, there is this real world context in the sense that, you know, maybe there'll be different cultural contexts, like, you know, I mean, you know, one thing that does happen in Skyrim is that, you know, and so it's like and so when you place it into that context, it's like, okay, the job market's in the shits, and oh yeah, they say, well, in this specific out of context moment, this looks dodgy. And the thing is like, so much, and that's going to be taken out of context. Oh god. But multiverse, as every other piece of fiction that I write, the context for the D&D game is okay. You're not providing any wider context either, you know. I mean, this is the thing, is that I don't...
Things that will sound terrifying out of context. Maybe that should be what my biography is called when I'm dead. And now I know somewhere there is going to be just a GIF circulating, completely out of context. Just, Hitler was right! And isn't that quote going to get used out of context? But Donald Trump, let's say, divided by the cultural contexts of, slavery and all the horrible shit that's happened, shitty and small, and doesn't give me the other context I need to fucking write this. So therefore, I can understand. So, this has a context to me now that it did not have to me when I first read it for GCSEs. Because when I first read it, that people didn't bother to properly fucking read it, they just read it out of context. Right? It wasn't particularly great in context, but tangents are also a thing that are very neat. But the context is that I am currently cycling around.
I think I need to talk about the different contexts, okay? Because I think that this book is something that,
and it can use that to work out what the social context is. You certainly can, I mean, do this series and that series and that series, and none of the context was there. What there was context for was bombs. Diesel whistled. Impressive, sir. How can you? The banker grinned. Context sensitive. You're a durable toy, not a soldier. To do this in a way that fits within the context and their writing style, and that is not a problem for the people who are.
The thing that people make is that it's good in the context of the time. At the time, it was good. Well, guess what, guys? It isn't that time anymore.
Time to go over to a place and learn its rules, learn its codes and contexts, and I don't have the time. This is the YouTube comment section. This is the context upon which I know people are gonna tell me to kill myself. This is the context. You kind of gotta alter it more, and you've got to make it fit in context. And because, we all know how the right likes to take things out of context. But, there were these this odd thing whereby if you've got Asperger's syndrome, you can just sort of tell when you're missing some context, right? So
that I have through this cultural context more. So now I think we need to look at the historical context, because I didn't notice the first time round, because in the context of everything that's going on and stuff, context was there. What there was context for was this person in reality and this other person who has the same name, and saying, well, people will be smart enough to figure it out. I am putting it out there as one thing in context with, and this is why I'm part of on the part of people sort of partaking in context, in content and taking it out of context. Left and right of the political spectrum to ignore the surrounding context and cherry-pick phrases for which to loathe me, I felt it was better to... When I first watched it, there was a certain amount of context there. There was a certain amount of, in the broad context of the multiverse, it sort of makes sense. What the fuck does that mean? If you're from this context and that context, what does it mean there? And what does it mean that? They work. Right? And in certain situations, in certain contexts, they've already been on their own. They work. Lest we forget that communism, when you look at it independently without context, looks okay.
They're really not nice guys. So it's kind of understandable why, you know, in that context, it's much less black and white, despite the fact that this post was essentially them covering their arse, taking things out of context, and saying, so therefore, fuck him. Context. Right? It wasn't particularly great in context, but out of context, it's a fuck of a lot worse. And I'd be paying attention to grammar and context, and you know, and to, you know, nuance. Don't know anything, you know. You've got to have something to begin with, some kind of context for what you're about to learn.
I have to wonder about the context that is basic. That context is kind of, we're going to kick you out into the bad man ship, which of course, sorry for this kind of rambly review, but there we are. You know the context, you know why I feel this way, and I think Matt Farr says this, but I'm probably taking this out of context and misremember it slightly. But apparently, according to Sir, you make it personal. That's when they're off balance. Okay, so let's bring this back to the context of war, right?
It's the cultural context changes, but the character is still the character. This is going to be another fucking one that's going to be taken out of context, I know. But Bam Kirsch is a
spook article that was taken out of context and overblown, but this idea that, you know, Kindle's going to charge by pages
from their job. And you don't know the context behind the tweet. You don't know the reasons. You know, and besides, like,
I'm even prepared to accept the fact that the people who just sadistically hate me may have some contextual, situational, like, reasons that shit like that. I mean, it's all about context, and I do think that on certain occasions, I acknowledge that they are pulpy and sound very, very wrong out of context, and only sound marginally better in context when you.
Now, I can learn. I can teach myself to update context awareness, right? It's context sensitive. My advice to you is, by all means, watch this video for information and to provide context, but use this as a guide to help. Putting this onto the Alex Vents channel, but this is in the context of shit that has been going on with regards to my main. In a context where I was, you know, the bully. I'm not saying that, you know, my childhood was to anchor conversations, a sort of contextual waypoint for social situations. I think of myself as a very shy person, and yet obviously context, and so that's why I like to say no, this context, right?
Really, you know, if you want to take another look at it, if you don't want to look at the actual, like, context behind why that was important.
Sort of make a video to sort of add context to the last video where I basically did just have a meltdown. Body language can't process social fucking context. And then, you know, also I'm on the autistic spectrum, and for me.
But suddenly he has placed the world within a context that I have been fully exploring, that I am exploring as I listen to this.
And then define what I mean by a cunt in this context. The pejorative, derogatory.
or my opinion might be being affected by these contexts. Okay, so London Falling was a problem, even in our historical context. But then, yeah, you kind of fail to acknowledge that the past was racist.
The Tharshnook and the fiction and the things and the context. And so this is me. I'm now going to do story time. I am going sort of, in the context of World War Z, it's a line that you do kind of gloss over because it's just like,
that's why I'm explaining the context. So now let's explain the context of the Seven Streets, because I've explained the context of London Falling.
Different theatre of war with this context of ISIS. That's why I'm not completely freaking out over this. But word was grit. See if she can't whip something up for you. Lisa beamed. I said, bit of context, please. Oh yes, of course you weren't there, were you? Thanked Anthony.
You want someone who's got a bit of context, and when the entire country is in uproar, will say, "Hey,
you know how my videos are taken out of context by Nazis who hate me. Out of context, although to be fair, even in context, a lot of this stuff is fucking weird. I make these videos for me, and I have nothing else. Upon which I know people are gonna tell me to kill myself. This is the context upon which I know people are going to be working against me. Oh. There is no shielding, no context, no work to build up a different character, a different... But you put it up on the big screen, you divorce it from the context, you divorce it from political video. But I kind of have to explain some context first, because basically, I've been drinking. So context.
I think it's kind of cool if I hear a long word to try and work out its context, and I would try and work out its meaning so I can use it in the appropriate... There's a difference between the kind of cultural context of privilege and experience that I think really the context makes a great deal of difference. Okay. At least in terms of my enjoyment and understanding.
I mean, he's a bastard, and he shouldn't have done it. But in the context that this is a world where this context, right? The reason you can't understand autistic people is that you are 40, 50,000 word piece of stuff. There's context here, there's explanations here, there's lore here. No, fuck that. This isn't good. Real world context, this isn't good. It's sort of like, my
are bad. I use them for a good purpose, and I am aware of the wider context, so that's what I'm saying, And it's very much within the context of it's a challenge, and there's puns, and there's other things like that. Whereas,
I suppose it's a primer to at least give some context, because again, as already discussed, I think the fact that he presents enough of circumstance and context that, yeah, you do understand why the fuck they felt this way, at least up until... Funnily enough, this is one of those occasions where, in terms of the context of this guy, clearly being, a member... Watching The Phantom Menace on its own and watching it in context with the other things, with the other film. Bloody story. So expecting people to keep track of context across multiple different stories was gonna be a bit of an ask. Dark and horrible, in the context of the other stuff that I have written, what happened?
coming up to you saying, "I would like to destroy you, please." Like, I don't care about the context in that situation. That's...
I was like, fair enough, but you're kind of missing the context, you know, because it's the idea of essentially
how fucking good a life I am leading because of a cultural context that I was born into, okay?
people don't watch the whole video and they like to take things out of context. So, I want to be clear. I've been drinking, but that's the context. That's why I'm sort of celebrating. Is that yes, I have
Way, but mundane in a wider context. Like playing well at a computer game to your group of friends. It's a big deal. But
presumably watched very specifically out of context to not understand it, or they were someone being malicious. Regulating them makes it okay, right? It makes it better. Yeah, but you have to look at the context that this is in. This kind of that arrived, that big box of stuff, which obviously in context felt like a bit of a gut punch. It seems like you have to make it believable. You have to. There has to be an understanding of context and reason behind it, right? Just the term teen being used in a sexual context squicks me out. It just does.
To educate your children about that, and you need to educate them about the historical context. Except we don't remember the last.
What actually tries to give a context and grounding as to how the fuck this is supposed to work, right?
Context. Feminists don't see it in a wider context. Feminists don't see men killing,
and therefore understand and therefore have a concept and context for it, right? And therefore we know what to do in that situation.
Falling on all these things that I have watched and I've got experience with, because I have to try and provide context for this shit. And also, let's be honest, willing pets doesn't feel right, even if within the context of the world, yeah, there are
a whole level of cultural context and baggage that comes with the idea of, you know, black people in cages.
You know, and it's just like, no, it doesn't matter the context in which you do something. People still shouldn't be.
Than something presented without any kind of context or evidence at all is going to have. And
In this situation, I want to make this attack. I know what I'm going to do, but this is D&D, so there are contextual situations. What happens?
Ground. And bear in mind the context in which this was shared. For
legitimate reasons they feel for taking things I say in a context which makes me sound horrible, because it was kind of a throwaway joke and it kind of makes sense in the context of stuff, because, you know, obviously at the end of the thing, you know, I'm not doing this because I'm not doing this in context or anything. I'm not going to do this in the... You watch this. I am very sorry for mentioning you in this video, in this context. Anyway, I'm gonna go away now and write my thing. That delivers the weight by which people's minds are changed. The facts on their own without the context of detail and emotion are meaningless, or at least...
kittens and shipping. You know, it's like, it's as out of context for him to see me disagreeing with his opinion. Definitely better than the second game. The second game is definitely adding context to the first one, throwing in a bit of shade to some of is within this particular setting and set of contexts a different kind of thing could from a certain point of view basically be slavery or
justified. You know, I can understand in the context of this why this might be justified, because ISIS is
things out of context. So it's a bit annoying that they take things out of context. Not least because, you know, the people that I act from one of my videos, and they upload it out of context, right? And the idea of fair use is that, you know, can it... What do you mean? I have to get a job. And that's going to get taken out of context. You know,
the context of the Seven Streets, because I've explained the context of London Falling as a contrast, and now let's explain the contrast said person is referenced. Now, you can read the full article for the full build-up and context, but I'm not really...
Definitely better than the second game. The second game is definitely adding context to the first one, throwing in a bit of shade to some of the context of fucking Ewoks. You need the context of Han being a melodramatic whiny puppy in if I get distracted, if I get stressed, if I don't know the person, if I don't know the context, I can very easily say the wrong thing and offend people. When new people come onto the channel, they don't know the context, so they just see me and they go, yeah, I have questions. So fuck it.
As part of the story, as part of the context, as part of, you know, the reason why I...
So I feel like I need to give some context, right? Now the thing is, I don't give a shit. I don't. Some women within a certain context, and also kind of with the stuff that I write, you know, because I am someone that you then later find out, like, context or why, or, you know, things like that, and it's like, it doesn't...
It kind of like, I don't want to do it, it's a repeat, but I've got to see it because of context. And yeah, honestly, I think because the thoughtful nods are made, but they are made from within the context of a gripping story with characters.
You know, you're in a context that divorces people from any individual indicators of who they are. Like, he can't see the cultural context as to why, you know, after centuries and, you know, generations and thousands of years, suddenly I'm trying to listen to this time-sensitive, low-context data, whilst at the same time this time-sensitive
Kind of understand the kind of historical, cultural context behind the I'm not a racist, but because
people from any individual indicators of who they are. You're in a context where they're following a script, they're following procedure. So at least if I'm doing a strange voice, when people put them out of context, it's a bit fucking obvious that it's not fucking me speaking. And they don't read around the rest of the fucking context, they don't understand what the fuck's going on, but still... The songs. And when you watch the songs out of context, when you watch Let It Go out of context, it seems like really nice and empowering. Setting the work of major and lesser known political philosophers within its historical context, this book offers a balanced and considered
of taking what I say out of context. The Daily Shower. Because when I do a video ripping into
such as e-contracting, which is discussed within the context of Electronic Commerce Regulations 2002, provides a straightforward, comprehensive, and accessible introduction to content. Remember exactly what happened the last time I read it. Contextual memory of like, I'm doing the thing, I remember doing the thing the last time I did.
killing a British citizen, full stop. Okay, now I understand in the context of this why. I just thought it would be a nice idea to put in some kind of context and perspective. And
they are interpreting all of this cultural and social context. And so that's why I like to say, no, this context.
now I think we need to look at the historical context, because whilst I have been unemployed and kind of
always going to be a part of myself that was brought up in this, very, in this cultural context. And so when I was, everything else that gave context, I mean, it was still shitty and I shouldn't have done it and I'm sorry, but like, of the self-cure and how that works and what have you, and all of that context that was basically missed because someone just searched.
That's possible. That's why I'm explaining the context. So now let's explain the taking Facebook statuses and other scenes out of context. So I know there will be. All I will say is kind of,
because you've had ethicists and philosophers and so many people from so many different contexts giving their perspective, and so I feel like it's important to kind of give reviews in the context of, I have seen this film having all. But okay, a bit of context, right? So obviously, not so long ago, I ended up. I'm very much someone who extrapolates based on circumstances and context and tries to define solutions. I'm saying all the stuff they want to say, but with all the context of speaking face to face, but without the time pressure of speaking face to face.
well, okay, some context, because yeah, I'm an atheist and I don't like religion.
Over taking stuff out of context, I have had the right-wing fake stuff to get at me. That essentially a bunch of people read shit out of context. I mean, the crux of their argument was, it's a trans cure. Alex Day, he's a horrific abuser, yeah, but he created good music. In the context of the music that he created, that's still partaking in context, in content and taking it out of context. Because clearly I am someone who suffers from that myself. Because people didn't fucking bother to read the fucking context. How dare you? You provided sexual reassignment surgery in a bottle. That's totally evil.
I genuinely can't understand how they are privileged, because they might have their own context. They might be Asperger's, they might have some other condition.
With developing these kinds of, context-sensitive tools. But I do feel like sooner or later, this sort of getting things done philosophy is that you need to have a different location with a limited context, right? Like, because you need to limit, say, having that be put in the same context as kind of evidence-based. Well, if you look at this, and you look at this, and you look at this, you see
into a political ring in any kind of official context, like being a reviewer, being being a reviewer, and I could understand it, and there was a context, and like, Paul Cornell does, he's not doing the Ben Aranovich thing of trying to code.
Those are the two things that pretty much say, in a literary context, in a fictional context, yeah, these people can just suffer now. Little context. I'm currently cycling around the clock. Always take my my words out of context, and they will always try to rile up hate against me because they're vulnerable. Quoting somebody, or is that supposed to be me? What's the context here? And then I love this comment.
Writing in this situation, in this context, about this guy who is the bodyguard to a prime minister, and I've
context. Much less fucking context. Right? All you've got is the sound of the other person's voice at the other end of what they're saying. It's a cure for trans people. That's clearly obnoxiously wrong. Whereas in context, it's basically, essentially, I do not generally look up words in the dictionary. I judge them from context. And, like, friend zoning is, I thought, literary context, in a fictional context, yeah, these people can just suffer now. These people, we don't need, they don't deserve.
In a context where I was, the bully. I'm not saying that, my childhood was
Haters who will take this out of context and who will post this all over their website going, oh, look at the potato. That is an interpretation that doesn't make sense within, the context of evolution and physics. And I know that
things happen in a sci-fi sort of context that are strange and odd and stand out and make you feel good.
The ever-living shit out of me and love taking me out of context. So, yes, I like eating chicken too much to stop eating it, so
would not have been so bad if the other shit they did was not so bad, Context makes a great deal. Suddenly having God turn up at the end to save the day. Because it's an outside context thing. Because, I mean, it's like Voyager. Voyager is bullshit.
Just gonna ignore and take what I say out of context. Fine, this isn't for you. This is for people like my friends, right?
In a wider context, but my point is that women don't see it in a wider context. Feminists don't see it in a wider
language, but missing so much context or whatever, and I don't know how her mind works. I mean,
the idea of a revolution within certain contexts. And I have a blog that has like a breakdown, okay? Try and see in the context of that light of saying, okay, why explain the context of London Falling as a contrast, and now let's explain the context of the Seven Streets. Seven Streets.
Allegory cannot be applied to any other different context, as though a tool can only ever be used for one thing. In the sort of context of Firefly, in the sense that Firefly has got this very set beat of social processes, is that they aren't good at understanding social context, right? And even if they did, what you could do is all of soup, and it's like two different shots, totally different context, like there's no script.
And get it done, and it can be okay. And when I read it, I remember the context in which I wrote it and I remember,
right? They might know the context, but they don't know the individual words and meanings. They just know, I make this sound wrong. I don't need someone to provide a counter context, especially through the means of a right-wing
quote. That's the Times, just taking something out of context, I think. Labour is plotting Scottish alliance. There is a minimal amount of exposition. Delivered basically to give context. But other than that, there's a lot of showing Nazis implemented, independently of context, looked okay, ultimately, like, from that, and when you look at it independently without context, it looks okay. Lest we forget that communism, when you look at it independently,
but feminism has generally solidified certain rules and contexts and understandings of this is what is acceptable, this is what is
not good. Like, it doesn't matter about the wider context, right? We're living in a world where black people are killed every day by police.
Horrendous cold. What's making it? I am aware of the context in which I am making the statement, but I'm going to make it anyway because, of course, that they include me within that. Because I wrote a story that they took out of context. And again, right, this sounds incredibly callous, out of context, right? Went to the washing up, you horrible. Your body would just transform to be who you are inside, right? But people didn't read the context, or see the sort of way that it. Before I begin, some context for you. The Democratic nomination race between Clinton and Bernie is close, worryingly close.
Again, I realise wider history and wider context, but your film is about confirming the guilt and basically breaking the precedent.
That would be a scenario where I'd genuinely be happier in a genuine sort of BDSM context, because then I could get the reassurance of
and dealing with this, wider negative context. So I really like, my life genuinely is at a point now where I can,
and that will be taken out of context, but that's okay because I am a dick. Because I am going to hell, as can be known.
Okay, so this is the context. So this person has been doing this thing, a group project, kind of a presentation thing.
Humans do not make decisions without context, right? The whole reason to process. But text is bad because it's low data, right? It's all context sensitive, right? And this is a situation may be somewhat unique, right? But specific contexts aren't really what's important here.
And so that's the context. The context is very much British men at risk doing all they can, work, and a weasel that belongs in the series, and an outside context weasel that just shouldn't be there, or we move in together, we'll get a house and shit. But it's like, no! Fucking mourn! I mean, I understand why in the context of this show they didn't.
When I know the context of why that scene is there, what I was trying to do, and what my intent was, and all, because phones are instantaneous communication. Phones have much less context, much less fucking context. Right?
Is an attitude that happens outside of the bloody sexual context. This is something that happens outside of patriarchy.
These fucking problems, and oh my god, the dialogue, and like, you need the context of, like, of the Sand People from Naboo. You have a different position, a different situation, a different context, and but in my context, I can't. So that's out the window. Only are we going to make it so you don't have the context of face-to-face communication. Not only are we going to make it so you don't have the time to wingers speak, they fucking take that out of context to represent me. That's a funny joke, and then you look at the context, and the context is, well, men gain power as they age, women lose it as they age. And, you know, they're an entirely fake thing, right? I don't know, I don't have the context here. So I'm gonna let you judge for yourself. He hates speech to use certain words because of certain contextual understandings. Right? I have sort of a contextual memory, which is like, you know, I can remember what I'm doing, I can remember everything. To update context awareness, right? It's context sensitive. And so I know at this point that it's practically a running joke that people really have to, you know, I can think about this stuff in a kind of abstract context, you know, I can read about quantum, and I wrote that scene in that context of everything is tremendously hot, but just that idea of just, I mean, what the kind of cultural context of being in a given situation, like, you can compute this stuff, right? Almost resigned to the fact that this would be taken entirely out of context, although to be fair, even in context, a lot of this stuff is fucking weird.
And I know that it exists outside in a wider context, and but my point is that
doesn't look real. And I suppose maybe that's the case with, you know, context and psychology and stuff, but still. Right? You know, the whole reason fashion exists is because having a context to decide what looks good
do with it is that there is this context. Okay. This context for the story, because a lot of the political...
Okay, context, I mean, it was still shitty and I shouldn't have done it, and I'm sorry, but, like, it made more sense in context. Wasn't necessarily still...
Okay, the books that I have, what you can be, okay? Just based on the contents page, okay? So...
yeah, it causing problems. I didn't want to risk it being taken out of context, and plus, there is a thing with YouTube rankings whereby people didn't even read the context in the one bloody story. So expecting people to keep track of context across nation is the characters and the world and the context and the themes and the concepts and how it all just hangs together, and is just, you don't even need to take things out of context, right? You can present the fucking text of the fucking narrative and say, okay, this is a...
By my experiences, both of London Falling and the context surrounding that, and of the context surrounding my...
So, what is the objectively better scenario without context and evidence, and without a moral framework that I can understand? Necessarily fully aware of this context of the situation of what's going on. And it's also saying that, you know, afterwards, you know, you're...
Women and men being abusive to women in the wider context of just generally men are shits.
Ziploc bag. A Ziploc clear plastic folder and pointed to the contents inside. Common on garden, self-pill, collar, and that make you feel such hatred. Have 12 hours of them. And I should provide some context, because you see, that was a nice thing to sort of have context for from there. And you know, I obviously, you know, I know about the Second World War from like the when there are clear contextual clues that this is not reality, that saying that somehow this makes terrible sense out of context. Anyway, I'm going to cut this out. Interpret body language and see myself in the context of how other people see me. You know, I am crap at social podcasts because I want to know the context and I want to know what the hell happened, and you know, I'm sure fucking policewoman who doesn't understand the situation in the fucking context say, but he was just being a good father. No, he fucking... The world doesn't work like that. If this was an outside context incident and this was bigger than me and her, this was bigger than any of the Sand People from Naboo. You need the context of fucking Ewoks. You need the context of horrible person. And it's like, I am a horrible person. You don't need to use quotes taken out of context of me quoting other people, right?
Wider context. Feminists don't see men killing women in the wider context of men killing people generally. They don't see
privilege, right? But it's kind of to give you context, to kind of understand what
very, very wrong out of context and only sound marginally better in context when you realise that actually the reason it sounds so wrong.
I'm being very careful about what I say, by the way, because people have taken things out of context and they're like, oh, why do you always use... Very much free speech in that context is entirely at risk. In that context, you are watched, Big Brother is always watching you. They managed to make magic work within a sci-fi context, which, let's face it, the modern world is it in this way, in that way, means this. When they say it in this context, and this means this, and that. And you're like, real world context here, this isn't good. Real world context, this isn't good. Was essentially a piss take send up, taking things out of context to make me sound like I'm a right-wing bastard. Because of that one small part without the surrounding context, then you are...
Is, to all people who are going to take things out of context, and I entirely understand that there will be, because context for Servant Streets later on, like, it's that level of realistic.
Reading this book, I am especially fucking aware now of, like, the contexts within which those mistakes were made. Is getting more and more workable, where we're getting more context-sensitive stuff, you know, speech-to-text recognition and stuff like that. And I have upset quite a lot of people. You don't need to take shit out of context, but... Sorry. Tangent aside, not good to be stalked by Nazis who hate your guts. People take them out of context, so at least if I'm doing a strange voice, when people put them out of context, it's a bit certain likelihood that you're going to be nicer, because you'll at least have stayed to know the context and whatever, and you know. In the context of the series, it kinda fucking makes sense. Right? Like, on their own and have a little conversation away from the setting and the context, you know. It'd be like, you know, Yeah, fucking misunderstanding. These are people who take things out of fucking context, who can't possibly understand the idea that there might be such a thing, or homogeneously aligned within the culture of that particular cultural context than, let's say, divided by the
saying be politically savvy, be aware of the wider context, okay? Because at the end of the day, right, feel so tremendously distasteful. And yet, within the context of the story, right, his character is that essentially he is
once in a whole thing so that you can look at it in context, right? And you know, the stories will be relatively standalone, just to the parts that mention trans people. So they missed the whole context. They missed the transformation sequence. They missed how the fact that, you know,
nothing to do with this video or the contents of it. He doesn't know it's being recorded. You know, this is just me.
the black people. And I know that's going to be taken out of context, but fuck it at this point. Fuck it at this point.
But you do have to wonder about the context that is basic. That context is kind of
because, you know, the people that I actually fucking gave a shit about took things out of context, and I'm totally not still bitter about.
And so when you take it out of the context, then suddenly that abstract information.
I'm now getting better and better and further away from that. But with that context kind of still so fresh in my mind, it's like
Of the world, it just doesn't feel right given the cultural context. And the thing is, I have no answer for this. I have no answer. I mean, I suppose what
contemptuous insult and joke that you don't need to take things out of context. So it's a bit annoying that they take things out of context. The fact that they take things out of context is not a good thing. It's annoying. It's just a little necessarily still brilliant, but it made more sense. It's less terrible in context. And it's like, you know, I make a video yesterday.
by the very nature, the very historical context behind the patriarchy, even though you are in a position of power,
It was a little thick aspect, and if you read it in context, I think it makes sense. It all ended up essentially being due to people taking me out of context. And now and so I am aware that in this, you know, context of a consent culture, you know, of the politics of the situation and of the various different contexts and circumstances that people who are
historical context and reasons for this, I am going to lay out who I am, because I think
it makes sense in context, but not if you think about it for one fucking second.
of the context surrounding my reading of the sex speech itself, because
of course I know someone's going to somehow take it that out of context because they're not going to have heard of the phrase or the term, but you know. And that also will be taken out of context. It's however much it is one small part of a larger context, I can understand how this dressing it up as, well, there's one quick, easy, like,
individually decide based on the evidence available, based on the context of their own lives, that actually I'm going to get annoyed about this.
Because that's where the boys are at. And it's like, haha, that's a funny joke. And then you look at the context, and the context is, well, men gain power.
because basically I've been drinking, so context is required. I say personally, because in the wider context, we're fucked. We are